You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Chanel Cleeton.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show coming up for you. As always, go to hankgarner.com where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, YouTube. Anywhere that you like to get your author interviews, you can find us there. I'd like to thank Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White today for sponsoring this episode with their book, The Fire Thief. She fights to survive, but only white-hot rage will reveal her true power. Remembering the hope of the past helps Stasha endure her bleak present. Blaming herself for her best friend's injury, she brawls and steals to provide in a world run by Fae. But with an arranged marriage approaching, Stasha swipes 2 silvers in hope of their escape and erupts into a fiery burst of magic. Surprised and confused by power she can't possibly control, Stasha barely has time to register that her friend has been sent off to die. With time running out and no options left, she must put her faith in powerful strangers as they dive into a Fae skirmish for supremacy. Surrounded by dubious allies, her only hope to redeem her past is to mount an attack on an inescapable death camp. As Stasha fights to free her friend, the battle she's faced her whole life is about to become a war. The Fire Thief is the first book in an exhilarating high fantasy series. If you like gutsy heroines, elemental magic, and epic sword and sorcery action, then you'll love New York Times bestselling authors Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White's roller coaster tale. Buy The Fire Thief to unlock an ancient Fae destiny today. Also thanks to Beatriz Perez and the Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. There are 5 volumes out, and a 6th one comes out this summer in the Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. Each release includes between 10 and 15 short stories, followed by a Q&A with the author. Some of the writers are New York Times and USA Today bestsellers. Some readers are saying it's a blisteringly good collection. These stories are full of great complex characters, not all of them human. Twists and turns and fantastic world building. Epic space battles, exotic aliens, far-flung planets. 15 fabulous tales that will thrill and surprise you, some chosen from previous Beyond the Stars volumes and some brand new, are in the Best Of collection. Come along as these award-winning authors sweep you along on adventures as broad as the universe and as deep as their imagination. The Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. Pick it up today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Chanel Cleeton back on the show. Last year, she had a phenomenal breakout hit with her book, Next Year in Havana. She follows it up today with When We Left Cuba. It is out everywhere now in Kindle and audiobook and paperback. Any way that you read books, you can get When We Left Cuba. It's a fantastic book. I've had a copy of it for a little bit now, and it's amazing. Welcome back to the show, Chanel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be back.
I'm excited to have you. So what's been going on this last year?
It's been wonderful. I'm so happy that Next Year in Havana was selected as Reese Witherspoon's Hello Sunshine Book Club pick for July of last year. So it was really wonderful to meet all of her readers and to have the book be part of that. And then now I have the follow-up, which is Beatriz Perez's story, When We Left Cuba. And you met her in Next Year in Havana. She's one of Elisa's sisters. And now she's telling everyone, her story.
Yeah. When the book first came out last year, and this was a story that was very personal to you. We talked about it, and there were lots of family connections in your family that really inspired the story. This is not a story about your family, but it's definitely inspired by your family connections, right?
Yes, absolutely.
When you're writing a story like this, and it's so personal to you, and there's one thing when the story goes out to the rest of the world, and then you have to share these characters with everyone else, and then after it's been out for a few months, then someone like Reese Witherspoon picks it for her book club, and then it just kind of goes to an astronomical level from there. What was that feeling like when these characters in the story that you made then goes to a whole other level?
It was incredible. I mean, it definitely feels a little bit surreal. I think you said it really well. When you write a book and you do have this personal connection, you never know how it's going to be received or how it'll be launched into the world. So you just kind of have your hope for it, and the hope that readers will embrace the characters and will enjoy the story you've told. But there is so much unknown and uncertainty about it. And so to have Havana have had the reception that it received really has just been tremendously special. And it's been wonderful to hear from more readers and to be able to connect with them and to have so many people reach out to me. I've had a lot of Cuban-Americans reach out to me to share their family stories and to tell me how the book touched them or things that they related to. And that was so important to me when I was working on the novel. So it's really meant a great deal to be a part of that conversation.
In last year's book, let's recap for people that are maybe not familiar with that story. What's the elevator pitch for that book, Last Year in Havana?
Sure. So with Next Year in Havana, it was really inspired by my family's history, as you mentioned. My father and my grandparents left Cuba in 1967, and I sort of grew up on their stories and their memories of Cuba and their love for the island. So the genesis for the book really came from one of those stories. My father told me a story of a night before they left Havana when everyone met at my grandparents' house kind of under the cover of darkness, and they buried their valuables in the backyard. And that was a pretty common practice back then. People would also bury things in the walls of their homes or smuggle it out of the country. Some women would try to sew things into their dresses and smuggle them out. So when I heard that story, I was just really gripped as a writer with the idea of if you were forced to leave the only home you'd ever known and you didn't know when you would be able to return, what would you choose to save for the day that you could go back? And that's really what inspired Next Year in Havana. It was a multi-generational story, so there's the historical timeline with Beatriz Perez and her family, and it kind of captures that lead up to revolution and then its immediate aftermath, and it shows them going through all of those experiences and kind of brought a bit of the Cuba that my grandparents experienced to life. And then also had a contemporary storyline where Lisa's granddaughter goes back to Havana to scatter her ashes. And so it was really, as you mentioned, a very personal book for me, and certainly kind of my love letter to Cuba and to my family.
One of the things I loved about that book are those multiple timelines, and the way that we got to dip in and out to see the story unfold from different perspectives and to really get a feel for the history that was then unfolding, in the present. And, was dealing with the story like that, was that your first intent in telling that story, was to get that kind of multi-perspective view? And is that when the story kind of unlocked for you?
It really was. I mean, from the first moment I conceived of the novel, I saw it with those dual storylines, and I think largely in part because I was so close with my own grandmother, and so I wanted to capture some of that relationship. And I think for a lot of those of us who are kind of the first generation born on American soil, we've all kind of had that similar experience of growing up with those stories and with the culture and the history being passed down to us. So I certainly wanted to honor that and to show the different perspectives of what it was like to go through exile, but also to look at exile as kind of a continuum and to see what the effects have been on later generations, and that sense of kind of having a disconnect where you don't have a physical connection to a place, but at the same time, it's such a huge part of your life.
Right. I think I heard or read somewhere that that the new book actually began when you were writing the first book. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. So as I mentioned, I had this idea for Next Year in Havana, and I really just envisioned it to be a standalone book and the only entry into the Perez family's life. And then as I was drafting the book and I introduced Beatriz's character on the page, I actually had to stop writing Next Year in Havana so that I could write the first chapter of When We Left Cuba, because I just had this really vivid image of her in my mind, and I heard her voice so clearly in my head. And so it was one of those things where the first chapter just sort of poured out of me, and I had to get it down on the page. And then I returned to writing Next Year in Havana, knowing that when I finished, that would be the next book that I would work on. And it was really kind of interesting to go about it that way, because when I then returned to Next Year in Havana, that's when I really saw the roots of Beatriz's story take shape. You know, I began to understand the relationships that would drive her and the events that would sort of serve as the catalyst for her actions and When We Left Cuba.
One thing that I love about your books is that you really make us feel a part of the place. And you do that with these great descriptions of people and locations, and with food. When you are painting this picture with words, what are the things that are important to you to highlight to make sure that we get that feeling like we're there with you?
Well, and very much so, it is important to me that my readers have that immersive experience, because I think when you read a novel, you want to learn something new, and you also want kind of that escape. You want a book to take you to a place either you haven't been or a place that you've been, and it feels like you're coming home when you return. So I definitely want to evoke that in my readers. I think for me, it really comes down to all of the senses. So I think you look at how you take in a place when you go there, or how you take in a memory. And, you know, it comes out in the colors or textures or the smells or the taste of food. So I try to engage as many of those senses as I can. And when I do my research, I really try to consume as much media as possible. I mean, down to the music that I listen to. I create kind of very specific playlists for my books, and I share those with my readers. And that just kind of helps me get in the right state of mind for what I'm writing. And hopefully that translates onto the page, you know, for the reader.
Beatriz, we meet her in Last Year in Havana, and what was it about her character that demanded that her full story be told?
You know, she was just such an intriguing character to me. I think she was both mysterious and very familiar. She definitely reminded me a lot of the examples I saw of Cuban women around me that I admired as a child. My grandmother had a very forceful kind of she was a force of nature, I will say. She had a very strong personality, and I always was really taken by that and looked up to that. And so I wanted to honor that and sort of capture that in Beatriz's spirit. But then she also definitely surprised me. You know, I didn't necessarily intend for the espionage plot that's in When We Left Cuba to be as big of a part of it is in the book. But she really kind of took me on that journey, and as my research uncovered more real-life events that it was appropriate that she could kind of insert herself into, I couldn't resist the opportunity, because she kept kind of nudging me at every turn that she didn't want to just sit on the sidelines, and she wanted to be involved in these historical events.
Well, since you brought up the espionage, let's go there for a second. What does Beatriz find herself involved in? And you know, the idea of strange bedfellows comes up.
Yes, so she becomes involved in one of the many CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. And it was really interesting when I was doing the research on this. I kind of laughed that it's one of those things where truth is stranger than fiction, because a lot of the methods that they employed were kind of something out of a James Bond novel. They were, exploding coral with the idea that he would just swim over and the coral would explode as he was going over it, or exploding cigars because he was quite a cigar aficionado. And one of the methods that they also used was trying to have one of his mistresses assassinate him. He was quite the ladies' man. And so they tried to have her do it, and she ultimately wasn't able to. But I really like to be as faithful to history as I can be, and so when I came across that, it gave me an opportunity to take my fictional character and give Beatriz that chance to insert herself into history. And she also becomes involved with some of the back-channel efforts with the Bay of Pigs and a lot of the exile groups and the things that they were working on during that time.
When you're researching stuff like that, was there anything that really surprised you about the things that you uncovered about about the relations between the two countries then, and how people there felt about what was going on, maybe as opposed or in contrast to, the things we're hearing in the United States about that time period and what was going on?
I think it was just interesting to kind of get that different perspective. My family was actually in Cuba during that time, and having grown up in the United States, I always heard about those events from the American perspective. But it was interesting to be able to speak to my grandfather and ask him, what it was like, and he told me that he remembered during the Cuban Missile Crisis looking out into the Havana harbor and just seeing all of these warships and being certain that they were going to die. And so it was definitely kind of a sobering and different perspective from the one that I had heard, necessarily growing up just in school in the United States. And also just really interested to hear about some of the espionage and how powerful and I guess kind of pervasive the Cuban spying apparatus was, and how much, work they did to try to infiltrate a lot of the exile groups and to try to keep tabs on what a lot of the Cuban groups were doing inside the United States.
A big theme in your books is this idea of exile and the idea of leaving family behind, striking out for a new life. But, the idea that to go somewhere new, you have to leave something behind and somebody behind. That's it's kind of pervasive throughout all the stories, is this kind of, this yearning for home, while also wanting, something new and to the ability to be the best you can be. Is that something that in the writing, is always front of mind for you?
I think because that was just so definitive in terms of the experience that I saw with my own family and the way that I was raised. I mean, I would say up until my grandmother's death, she spoke about Cuba as though any day she would go back. And while my grandparents certainly built an incredible life for themselves here and were very much, engaged with being U.S. citizens and very committed to this life, I think they always kind of looked back with longing and with the hope that one day they would return. So for me, exile kind of was always straddling those two things. And I think that's pretty common for a lot of Cuban-American families, in speaking to other readers, that they had similar experiences where, their families certainly worked hard to build a life here and made connections and certainly flourished and thrived, but had that kind of sense of always of when will we return.
This family is full of surprises. When you start writing Beatriz's life and her side of the story, if you will, how do you start fleshing out the family as a whole? Do you know going into the story all of the things that are going to unfold and how the family interacts with each other, or do the characters just kind of come alive?
Really, for me, the characters kind of drive the story. So usually when I start a book, I have an idea of the beginning and the end, but the getting there is always what develops as I write. And I will say that I think you saw a little bit of a different side of the family in When We Left Cuba. And next year in Havana, Elise is much more of kind of a peacemaker in the family. Her relations with her family members are a little bit smoother. Beatriz is the one that's always kind of challenging the order and fighting for what she believes in and kind of, I think, prodding people to think about things differently and to act. And so you see a little bit more friction in the family, but also I think that relates to what they've been through. I mean, next year in Havana, things are unfolding so rapidly that they're almost, just trying to react and get through, but you're not really seeing a lot of the events probably sink in just because they're going from crisis to crisis. Whereas in When We Left Cuba, you really see the impact that exiles had on each of the family members and the things that they're kind of trying to regain. For the father, it's very much a loss of financial security, and after all that he's been through, it's this need to have that financial security and those connections because he's seen how quickly anything can be taken away from you. For Beatriz's mother, it's this loss of social stature and this sort of insecurity of occupying this strange limbo where you're in a new country where you're not quite welcomed, but you don't know when or if you'll be able to return home. And so the family's grappling with a lot, and the book and the relationships really kind of show that as there's a little bit more conflict between the sisters and the parents.
Right. How long did it take you to write Next Year in Havana?
Next Year in Havana was a fast book for me. I would say from, first draft to turning it into my editor, probably about 4 months, and then we spent probably a few months going back and forth in edits and kind of fleshing things out.
Wow. What was the experience like writing the follow-up when we left Cuba? Was it similarly fast-paced?
I would say when we left Cuba took a little bit more time. I spent a bit more time kind of grappling with Beatriz's character and trying to decide what path she was going to take and kind of questioning some of her decisions and playing with those until it really felt like it was right for her character. And then certainly the research as well. I think with Havana, I had such a strong foundation for my family's history, but when we left Cuba, I started to go a little bit more into newer territory. I mean, I had definitely had kind of an overview of a lot of those events, and having studied international relations, that was certainly helpful, but it definitely was a deeper dive, I would say, into the research.
When you're writing the first book and you've got a blank slate, and you can tell the story any way that you want to. Well, when you're writing a follow-up that deals with the same family, are you constantly fact-checking yourself to make sure that the people are where they're supposed to be, or that you portray this character correctly, and to stay true to the things that you've already created?
And that definitely plays a bit of a role in it. I was fortunate that I wrote the books back to back, so the characters were still pretty fresh in my mind. But I think the other thing that I kind of gave myself a little freedom on was that when the perspective shifted, I felt like the character shifted a little bit. And I think, so much of relationships is how we see a person. And when you change who's looking at the family, it changes how the family operates a little bit. Elisa and Beatriz are just so different that some things that Elisa might have thought about her family are not necessarily the things that Beatriz would have thought, and vice versa. So it really did feel like, in a way, they were almost new relationships because I changed out the protagonist and the heroine of the book.
Well, first off, do you still have family in Cuba?
We have sort of distant family. My dad has a cousin, and we have some that have come over recently, but we don't have immediate family or anything there, no.
Gotcha. Have you visited?
I haven't. That was one of the things, I mentioned that story about the box in the backyard, and that actually came up because we had planned a trip. My grandmother has about 60 people in her extended family, and we had all planned a family reunion because travel was opening up. And in the course of us, kind of organizing the trip and paying deposits and that sort of thing, my grandfather, who's almost 96, became very upset with the idea of us going. And it really opened up a dialogue in the family about some of his anger and hurt and fear, really, about us going back. And so while I have quite a bit of extended family that has gone, my dad and I just decided, with him feeling that way, that it wasn't the appropriate time to go.
Right. Do you have relations between Cuba and the U.S., have they evolved to a point where travel back and forth is easier and more amenable?
It's definitely easier in the sense that you can take a cruise ship now and get off for a day trip, or there are a few more categories open. But I think that really, there's both countries are just kind of on a precipice. There's some changes in our relations with Cuba. There are internal changes within Cuba, and so it's really an interesting time to be writing about these countries and their relations to each other, because we are starting to see, obviously diplomatic relations have opened up a little bit, and so it will be interesting to see where things go from here.
Well, it's so weird because, my entire life we've had this strained relationship with this country that's, literally an hour and a half drive, if you could drive, right off of our southern, coast there in Florida. And it's this whole other world that is completely blocked off. And it's, I'm looking forward to the day when those relations are better.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that, do other family members, have a desire to go and to kind of dig into your personal history?
Yes, I mean, we have quite a few family that has gone back. And, I think in talking to a lot of Cuban Americans about this issue, I think it's just kind of a really complicated one. And there's no, kind of monolithic answer to whether or not, people want to go back, even within individual families. Some want to go back, some could never imagine doing it under these circumstances. So I think it's definitely a very personal and very difficult issue that everyone sort of grapples with. And while I completely, understand and respect why people do want to go back, and I certainly would like to as well, I think just given, the way my family feels about it, it just felt like it wasn't, the appropriate thing to do.
Right. What comes next? Is this family story finished for you? Have you closed it, or are there more stories to tell?
So I'm really excited to start following the Perez family through some different time periods and different moments in history. My next book, which is going to be out in the summer of 2020, is set in 1935, and it's set in the Florida Keys during the Labor Day hurricane, which was one of the deadliest storms in U.S. history. And basically there's this kind of intersection on this weekend in September where 3 women's lives are affected by the storm. One of the heroines is actually Beatriz's aunt, and she comes up from Cuba on her honeymoon and gets caught up in this event. And then I have another heroine who comes down on Henry Flagler's Great Railroad, which was sort of known as, colloquially one of the wonders of the world. And then a third heroine who's the native of the Keys. And the backstory with all of this is the United States sent several hundreds of World War I veterans down there to work on the railroad. They had been protesting in Washington about their treatment after the war, and it was sort of an out of sight, out of mind. The government set them down there to keep them out of D.C. and out of trouble, and unfortunately they were not evacuated or taken care of the way they should have been, and hundreds perished. So there's quite a few intersections going on in the story, and it was a really fascinating time period to research and to work on. So that one's finished and with my editor and edits. And then I've just now started researching what will be my 2021 book, which is set during the Gilded Age and sort of the Spanish-American War and Cuba's fight for independence against Spain, and features my first real-life heroine that I've written about. She was known as the Cuban Joan of Arc. Her name was Evangelina Cisneros, and she sort of comes to the attention of the New York papers and gets involved in this newspaper fight between Pulitzer and Hearst to try to pull the U.S. into war with Spain. And that one will be titled The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, because that was the title that the New York papers gave her.
Oh, I'm so excited. Those are going to be amazing. I love that the story is continuing and that we get to keep following this family and their exploits and so much good stuff. Chanel, if people are just discovering you, is there a place where they can find you online to dig into your back catalog, follow along with what's going on, and watch for news?
Yes, my website is www.chanelcleeton.com, and I'm also active on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and I love to talk to my readers about books.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to get their copy of When We Left Cuba. There's links to everything in the show notes. Chanel, love what you're doing. I'm a big fan, and we wish you much success on the new book launch.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all of your support.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On Walpurgis night, when the moon is high, hell's bells ring and witches must answer. They dapple their breasts with rendered fat of murdered babes, straddle their brooms and take to the sky, as the devil wills, to speed through dreamy midnight air to the summit of the Brockenberg, that haunted peak shrouded in swirling mists, where a glen of gnarled limbs and wan moonlight awaits to host their debauches and blasphemies. Now to the Brocken the witches ride. The stubble is gold and the corn is green. There shall the carnival sabbat be seen, and the devil shall come to preside. The accuser elopes from the bowels of hell, a sure-footed, goat-headed, many-horned beast with cloven hooves and a staff of bone. He perches upon the witch altar to brood in cerulean half-light, a winged silhouette with watchful red eyes. The witches gather and bow to their master, upon his charred rump give the shameful kiss, then imps beat the drum and a round dance begins. Lash yourselves into frenzy, hags! Pass the chalice of pure marrow broth. Whip the ground with your hair, tread the sky with your feet, dance with joined hands around Satan's cold fire. Then find out a nook of nettles and moss, and lay with the rough-skinned beast of your choosing, suckling some rancid teat of desire. But hist! The cock crows. Away, away! Gather your tatters and broomsticks and wits, back to your huts, to your thresholds and hearths, and become once more, at the red break of day, the furtive adder in your neighbor's garden. The ghost host of the Salem Sorcery Tour, dazzling in his steampunk Victorian morning crepe, let the spell he'd woven trail through the twilight air like a hag across the moon, then chirped, "Isn't that silly?" and bowed, sweeping the wet grass with his satin-ribboned top hat. The tour group gave a polite round of applause. Nobody believes that stuff today, but the Puritans sure did. They took witches very seriously. If they went down in the morning and bought eggs, and one was rotten, surely the devil had come in the night, gone boop, tee-hee-hee, then scampered off on his little hooves. And who's in league with the devil? Witches. We're taught that the Puritans were super nice and cute with little buckles on their hats, but it's not the case, folks. They were fanatics. Witch hunts don't happen in a healthy society. They hated kids. They hated women. They were crazy. And that craziness. He turned on the spot, casting a protective circle around the stone garden of the witch memorial. Got these people killed